the past 2 seasons of Fearless, we've explored the experiences and convictions that shape leaders. This season, we turn our attention to Africa. Across the continent and its diaspora, rich traditions of leadership, community, and belonging have shaped how people live, lead, and relate to one another. What might Ubuntu, Sankofa, Omoluabi, and other African philosophies offer a world searching for new ways to lead, connect, and flourish? Together with leaders, thinkers, and practitioners from Africa and its diaspora, we'll explore ideas of leadership, identity, belonging, and Pan-Africanism through personal stories, lived experience, and thoughtful reflection. My hope is that these conversations will broaden how we think about leadership and reveal the enduring wisdom Africa offers the world. I'm Udwa Kamimo, and this is Fearless. Welcome to Season 3. My guest today has lived at the intersection of Africa and its diaspora for decades. As a journalist, documentary filmmaker, writer, public intellectual, and advocate for the restitution of African cultural heritage, Onyekachi Wambu has spent much of his career exploring how memory, identity, and belonging shape both people and societies. Onyekachi left his native Nigeria after the country's civil war, the Biafran War, as a child. He grew up in the United Kingdom. Over more than 4 decades, Onyekachi has examined some of the defining questions of our time. What does it mean to belong to a nation, a continent, and a shared history? Through his work with the African Foundation for Development, AFFORD, he has championed the role of the African diaspora in Africa's development and led efforts to secure the return of looted African artifacts and ancestral remains. He's also the editor of Under the Tree of Talking, Leadership for Change in Africa, and Empire Windrush, 2 influential works that explore African leadership, identity, and the Black British experience. Onyekachi, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you on Fearless.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So we'll get started. And my first question to you, Onyekachi, is when did you first understand yourself to be African?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, as a child, you're just who you are. You're alive. You're taking in everything. Um, I understood myself to be different to some of the people that I was at nursery with in the UK in the early 1960s. Not African, but just I was different. They were white, I was black. Um, and then I understood myself to be, when we returned to Nigeria, we were, I guess, Nigerian, and then I understood myself to be Igbo and Biafran, and that was the language we spoke at home. Well, we spoke English, but when we returned to the village, that was the language that my broader extended family spoke, my grandmother and others. And she could hardly speak English, and so she tried to converse with us, and then at times she would then kind of insist that we spoke Igbo to her because the phrase was "speak something I can understand." So yes, so at that point you're beginning to get an idea identity around Igbo-ness, Easternness in Nigeria. And I never really felt Biafran in that sense. I loved the flag. I still love the flag. But the Biafran identity I never understood. I kind of always understood myself as an Igbo person. I guess I began to feel African when I returned to the UK in 1970. And there was then a project in trying to understand a lot of things. For me personally, I was trying to understand what had happened during the Civil War and why my identity and that identity, I suppose, as a Nigerian broke. And trying to understand that broader disruption, I guess, is what begins to put you on this journey to this broader African identity. I guess that's how I would explain it.
I want to stay with the Biafran War for a minute. What do you remember of that time?
Remember a contrast, contrasting emotions. It was an amazing time to be alive, which sounds really weird, but you're living life at such an intensity. Everybody, there's kind of destruction all around you, especially towards the end of the war. And so there was always this element of will you survive this? And because of that, you live very intensely. Um, we were surrounded, and there was the kind of the um, famine and the humanitarian crisis all around, and we were aware of that. Um, and so you everything is heightened. I guess that's what I mean about kind of excitement and life.
So you understand yourself to have, even as a child, you understand yourself to embody multiple identities. But how then? Actually, Onyekachi, what does your name mean?
My name,
Yes, Onyekachi.
my name is I guess it's a rhetorical question. So Onye means who in Igbo, Ka means greater than, or and Chi is um, the
Spirit.
spirit double.
Yeah. Who is greater
Your
than
spirit double.
spirit?
So it's literally, I guess, can mean who is greater than your spirit,
Mm,
or their spirit double,
mm,
meaning nobody, because part of your struggle in life is to balance with your spirit double, or sometimes do better than your spirit double. Your destiny is better than that. But Chi, since the Europeans came, has increasingly now come to mean God. So amongst the Igbo now, if you ask them what Chi means, they'll say it means God. Um, but it didn't.
mm,
It meant
mm.
kind of spirit. It used to mean spirit double. So if you ask me 150 years ago, it'd be who's greater than his spirit double. If you ask me now, it's who's greater than God. Um, but it's a rhetorical question.
Mhm. And what part of Eastern Nigeria are you from? Is your family from?
You mean the state or
The
the
state,
area? It's
state
Igbo
area.
land, and the state is Abia State.
Abia. So tell
So we are Ngwa. Our dialect group is Ngwa.
so tell me about the war and what you in.
Ngwa means Ngwa means like almost like let's go. It's a term that is kind of active. It's about agency. Ngwa.
So in Nigerian English, it would be, oh yeah, let's be going.
Yes, Ngwa.
So I want to stay
Something
with,
like
I want to stay with the war, the Biafran War. What do you remember of that experience as a child?
that. Well, I was a child. The war started when I was 7. Shortly after I was 7, and finished when I was 10. So that period was, was what is it the Jesuits used to say? Give me the boy until 7, and I'll give you the man. So it's a very formative period. So it was incredibly intense, and the most intense period I've ever lived in my life. Um, Full of, yeah, everything was heightened, all the emotions. So you're surrounded. As our territory shrank, we kept evacuating, and we were evacuating closer and closer to this very narrow strip around essentially the Uli airstrip, which was how Biafra was being fed. Stuff was coming in from the planes, because we had been, there was basically this siege, and we were surrounded totally. Um, So yeah, so it was just very intense. People were dying around you, but the other thing I do remember was just this incredible sense of solidarity because everybody had to rely on everybody else. So the social capital was amazing, but alongside that intense social capital, everybody felt threatened, and there was always this sense that the reason we were losing was because we were being betrayed. So there was also a lot of suspicion of different peoples, um, especially some of our neighbors from Igbo neighbors from the Delta area. And I think a lot of the sort of animosity that has carried over into today between us and our neighbors came from that period.
So looking back, and you've already talked about give me the child, and I'll give you a man. How have these experiences shaped who you are and the body of work you've shared with the world?
Well, we were, I would say a middle class family. My father was a divisional officer, so Nigeria kept quite a lot of the old colonial system, and the DOs were very powerful people as administrators. Initially, we came to London in this early 1960s when I was two because he was representing the old regional, the old eastern region. And in those days, the constitution really was decentralized, and the regions had real power. In fact, he came as a trade representative for the old eastern region, and he was here in London conducting. He was based at the Nigerian High Commission, but conducting trade and investment decisions on behalf of the old eastern region. And then the first coup happened in '66, in January '66, and he was reposted back. And then he became the DO for this area, um, E2, which was in Cross River. Um, and so we had this quite incredible lifestyle. We were in the old DO's colonial house, and it was a great lifestyle. And then over a period of the next 2.5 years, that world was shattered. And by the end of the war, my father had died, and other members of my family, my uncle, my mother's brother, had also died, and so there was a lot of kind of loss and all around, and then you have to then kind of try and pick up and remake the world that had been kind of broken. The old eastern region was in ruins. Um, my mother was in the UK because when we returned in '66 after the first coup, she stayed on in the UK to finish a nursing course that she was on. So we were separated during the war, which was a problem in itself. And then after the war, when my father was killed, and there was reconstruction going on in the east, she came back in October of that year, 1970, and gathered six of us, our children, and we returned to London and have been in London ever since. So I don't know whether being in London is kind of a refugee or whatever. Anyway, she was a British citizen by then, so she just came in and brought her children to London. I guess she also figured it would have been easier as a woman to raise her six children in London than it would have been without my father in Nigeria after the war.
Okay, so we fast forward to the start of your career, and you start out as a journalist and a storyteller. We have the BBC in common. But at what point do you realize that there is a particular kind of story, one, about Africa, and then two, that there are particular stories that Africa tells about itself? And how do you integrate those into leadership?
Well, as I said, my world broke, my African world broke. So, as a child, I'm intrigued. I'm trying to understand what happened. So even as a 10-year-old, I enjoy reading. So I'm reading vicariously, but I'm not um, reading necessarily about Africa. I'm just reading generally because
What are you reading?
there's oh, just I'm a 10-year-old, so I'm reading all, and I'm in the UK. You know, don't forget that for 3.5 years we barely had access to schools, books, to anything during the war.
So you're reading
Um,
Enid
I had a
Blyton.
number of sorry.
Enid Blyton,
Yeah, the Secret Seven. It's all adventure stuff.
Famous Five,
All
all of
that's
that.
yeah. So I'm just kind of reading all of that and interested in this world that these guys occupy, where the greatest distress is missing dinner or something. And we we just been through hell. So yeah, so that contrast was interesting. But what was more was just starting to look around me and try and understand what had happened to me, and then the things that I begin to pick up. We were in Finsbury Park, and in those days, Finsbury Park was quite a black area, and so we start interacting with all these other black people. So we know who the Nigerians are and who some of the other Africans are. But it was interesting now just meeting people from the Caribbean. And we used to go to this youth club, and there was a guy who was newly arrived from Jamaica, so he wasn't a black Brit in that sense. He was a Jamaican who just kind of newly came in. His accent was heavy, and also we were just getting into reggae music because the youth club played a lot of that. So I started to hear all the Toasters and Uroy and all the rest of them, and it was an incredible listening to this new music and just trying to get it. We had heard some stuff in Nigeria, Jimmy Cliff before that, but this was a new, I guess, this kind of dance hall, and also the um, the reggae music that was singing about Africa at this point by the 70s. You get this roots reggae music, which is incredible. Anyway, this guy, he's in a nightclub and he's talking, and then he says, Unu. And me and brother, we're like, oh, what did he just say? And he said, Unu. And then we said, oh, what does it mean? And then he explained what it meant. And of course, it meant what it meant in Igbo, which is you lot. And And then that was when I realized that the Igbo people had gone there. So that was a moment, an epiphany. And so you're then trying to, that music then begins to mean something else. And you start hearing in a lot of the music this real longing or to reconnect with Africa. And so you realize, oh, something else happened here that is worth following up on. And then the key thing about becoming a journalist was actually 5 years after the Civil War. I'm watching one of these programs on the TV. It's a current affairs, UK current affairs program, and they were doing 5 years after the Civil War and to look at how Reconstruction had happened. And I'm there watching it, so I would have been 15 at this point, and it was, you know, I was amazed by the program because as the program was going on, the interviewer was talking to some local people, and he got his fixer to do the translation. And then it was the first time I'd heard Igbo on the television because I didn't need the translator, and that was really interesting as a boy just being there. So I was amazed at that. But what then shocked me about the program was that They talked about the challenges of Reconstruction in the East, and and then later on, as the program progressed, so this was about 5, 10 minutes in, but as the program progressed, the storytelling became less about the people in the East and the Nigerians themselves, but about a lot of the white people who had helped with the humanitarian effort. And they began to tell the story. And I was just shocked. And in a way, it felt like at the end of it, being assaulted again, because the one thing I did remember from the time of going through the war was the solidarity that, as I said, that we had. And now to be told that actually, the white people have saved us was just, I, 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 I was, very angry at the end of the program. As I said, it felt like being assaulted again, and it wasn't because we didn't value the help, because the help came in. Um, I, we received one package from my mother from London, and I still remember opening that package, and there was a bar of pear soap. And to this day, I've always loved the smell of pear soap because by that stage of the war, we were using effectively sand and black tar, and it was perfumeless. It was, it scraped your skin off, but we were making our own soap, which was very sort of at that by that stage of the war, very crude, and then you got this package through from the humanitarian people, and somehow it was delivered to us, and then you opened it, and there was just this incredible perfumed soap, and that smell still is in my head. And every time I smell the pear soap, that orange transparent soap, it takes me back to that moment. So it wasn't that we weren't grateful, but throughout all that war, I probably only saw one white person. So, which was at the hospital I was taken to because I suffered an injury. And so then to be watching this program and to be kind of told that we had been saved, I obviously realized then and then that that I had a story to tell which contrasted with that story, and it was important in using the old adage that if you didn't tell if the lion didn't tell its own story, then the story would be told by the hunter, or the only story would be told by the hunter. So that was when it it that idea of actually being a storyteller formed. And the stories, initially I wanted to do it in film. I wasn't able to do that with the BBC, but I got this journalism opportunity with The Voice. And so we then had this incredible platform to try and work out where things were in the UK. We'd had uh, a generation that came over with the Windrush, or that generation that came post-war. They'd had children there, and the, that generation had very little expectations of the British, other than they be kind of treated. Many of them had come to work for 5 years and go home, so you know they did fight for rights, to be treated fairly, to not be discriminated against. But I don't think they were expecting to be integrated into society. Whereas the young people were born here and they felt that they were British, and then they suddenly discovered that the society had very little intentions of integrating them or indeed treating them fairly.
This is the
And so
period when this
there'd
is
been
the
a number
period.
of riots and
Yeah.
expressions and disturbances.
So
And the
this is
voice came out of that, which is why it's really important.
so this is
In 18,
you're referencing what the Brixton riots. You're referencing a time in the UK where you had these signs: no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. You're referencing a lot of seminal instances in terms of the racial um, and dynamics of the United Kingdom.
yeah.
And so you brought in the diaspora, and you straddle, both the continent and the diaspora. And before we get into what that actually looks like, again, back to you, what does that do to your sense of home? What is home to you? Where is home?
Oh, home is my village, and that's home.
Home is your village
Has
in
always been.
Nigeria, in Eastern Nigeria, in Abia State.
Yeah, it's the one thing that hasn't changed. Everything else changes. So I've never been not clear about that. But those things that I referenced, and no dogs, and I mean that was earlier. That was 50s, early 60s. By mid 60s, the civil rights business had got rid of that kind of overt, crude racism. What the young people were dealing with by 76, where you have the major street disturbances at the carnival, and then there's another big one in 81, was just this sense of being, not belonging and not being integrated. I remember at school, um, I was always very clear that I was from this village. The rest of my black friends were saying they were black English and all this as we were growing up. And then at 13, they suddenly discovered that um, the country didn't accept them or want them. And then most of them went through, a lot of them went through this identity shift, and they became Rastas in London, took on and started to, then talk about uh, being African, and then just reflected a lot of what was going on through the roots reggae music. Of course, by the 80s, roots reggae was over, and then you get kind of dance hall and a whole other ethos and philosophy, and you move. I have this theory that you're moving from sort of marijuana in the 70s and 80s to cocaine in the 80s, and everything shifts around that, and you know the logic of the drug and how you deal it and its impact on you psychologically changes societies everywhere. Um, and so by the 80s, that kind of roots rock, back to Africa thing begins to diminish, and you're getting a much more, um, what I would say is a kind of ragamuffin ethos that emerges, which is around gangs and cocaine dealing, and it's a major move, and you can see it reflected in the music as well. So that was kind of interesting. But you asked what else was going on from that, you know, let's say from the moment where you're thinking, I'm going to be a journalist and or a writer, and I'm still interested in being a writer. So what? And I'm reading, and at this stage, I'm just reading everything. So I actually just read around the world. So I read a lot of diaspora stuff from um, the African Americans, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, all these characters, Ralph Ellison. So I'm kind of reading all of that. And you get this incredible, um, you get this map, and bits of it are being filled in. And then I went through a whole other period where I just read French literature. So I did Zola and all the French greats, all the way to the modernists what's his name, the existential Sartre and the Nobel Prize, Camus. So you kind of just read all the French people, and then I did the Russians, and then I did the Jews, the Jewish writers, American Jewish writers, Bernard Malamud and God, what's his name in Chicago, and just so I went around the world really, and then obviously all the way through that I'm reading the African Longman series. So I'm reading all the African writers from Achebe and onwards, and Shoenka wasn't part of the Longman series, but I'd even go and read The Interpreters because I think he was with Hutchinson or another publisher. But so yeah, so the idea was just to kind of make sense through literature, and I think writers are great witnesses to what happened, and if you're trying to discover the soul of people, I think writers are always a good place to go,
Mm.
and musicians.
Musicians, well, actually, you talked about ragamuffin and the politics around it, and I'm thinking back to my dancing days, my disco days, and I'm like, well, we just really enjoyed the rhythm, and you're shedding light on what was going on, the context, what was going on between the lines of those rhythms that we so enjoyed. But you've got a new volume. You're working on a new anthology of the Empire Windrush. And given this background you shared about the Black British experience, you know, reading through the anthology and your reflections on Brexit, and the need for what you call a post-imperial Britain, you are calling for reconciliation and reparation. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I think I'm going through this journey, and you know, in the end, I become very interested in the African world, what I call global Africa in the 1980s. So a lot of my journalism is about that. Most of it is about the UK, but when I venture beyond the UK, it's really looking at that global African world. And then when I begin to make documentaries, it's about that global African world. So I make documentaries about crack cocaine in the UK and in the US. It was becoming a problem in the UK, so we said, let's go and look at how it worked itself out in the black populations in the US. And then, you know, we did for the BBC a whole number of documentaries around Africa. There was one we called at the end. I wanted to call it New Winds of Change. In 1992, there were all these elections in Africa as the Cold War ended and democracy was allowed once more because the Cold War competition had finished. So I was producer of that, series producer. So we were in Ghana, Angola, Algeria, where the election was, of course, cancelled, Zambia, um, Ethiopia. So there were um, 6 countries, and Cameroon, where elections were happening. And we were trying to understand what was happening at the end of that. So global Africa became my kind of terrain. And I actually, the last major thing I did as a producer was a Hopes on the Horizon documentary I made for PBS, where again we looked at um, 6 countries to try and tell the story of the 1990s in Africa, which we thought was about the return of civil society, essentially. So we tell the stories in South Africa, in Nigeria, Benin Republic, which of course had the first of those national conferences. Nigeria was really the story of the end of Abacha and return of to civilian rule and Ken Saro-Wiwa. And then we were also in Morocco, um, telling a gender-based story about how the women had reformed the Mudwana, which was um, um, the family code relating to women, and then Mozambique about some women who had kept Mozambique going through the civil war through their agricultural co-op. So there were all these really incredible stories of civil society returning, and then in South Africa it was a big story about how to return excellence through the school system. I see that failed. It's amazing how in 1998 we were so optimistic, and then we told a story in Rwanda at the end of the genocide about how they were trying to deal with their history uh, through the universities and civil society to so that they could plan a future. So my it was a long answer to a short question, but essentially what I'm trying to do now is just kind of understand the African world, and the more you understand, the more you realize that actually something happened 500 years ago that we have to deal with. When I started off in Nigeria, and to look at how my Nigerian world broke, it was obvious that we were all part of this thing called Nigeria, which had been put together in 1914 by the British. Basically, they started trying to put it together from about 1850 or so on, because the, log- the logic of the intervention was to get access to palm oil and the trade. And they saw this huge country opening up in front of them, as they did everywhere else they went to get resources. And so, yeah, so you understood that was the logic of that. The country was put together because initially they had two protectorates, one in the north, one in the south. And the whole logic of empire was that the resources returned to London. The resources in the south were returning to London, but in the north, they were having to subsidize it because the north wasn't making any money. And so they were like, you know, they knew that the public would start complaining that because the idea wasn't to subsidize the natives, it was to extract resources from them. And so what they did to solve that problem was to say, we'll merge the country, and the surplus from the south will then cover whatever deficits we were paying initially to the north. Um, and that was a logic for putting Nigeria together. So you're looking at how cynical a lot of this is. And then obviously, as independents, we all now inherit this these borders, this structure, and we try and make a go of it. And perhaps the more I, I age, the more I think perhaps the things should have been not dismantled but rethought how it was going to knit together. And then before 1850 and palm oil, the logic was and the trade was obviously enslaved humans. So this space was still very important, and it was actually called the Slave Coast, and took millions of those Africans, including Igbo people, to the Americas. And so you're understanding this, and you're thinking, well, if you're going to try and put correct some of this, you have to go back to the beginnings of this and to the people who were involved in creating these problems, who have never accepted responsibility for any of it, and to begin an engagement about how this is repaired and what does reparatory justice look like within that framework. So that's how it all kind of joins up. And then there's also just the realization that we lost the battle beginning with slavery in the realm of the military first. And this is what happened in Nigeria. We lost the military when we were colonized. We lost militarily, and then the company brought in the military. It was the company, the Royal Niger Company. And after the company came in, so we lost the economy uh, and the and the finance, and we lost in terms of the kind of the social spaces or the social aspect of it. We lost languages, we lost artifacts that were taken, humans were taken as trophies. So there's a lot of things that need to be corrected. And then we lost, obviously, politically control over our spaces. So the two areas in those bits that we as Africans have been very preoccupied with is the loss, so far, it seems, has been the loss of the governance space. So we fought to get the political kingdom back. Indeed, as Nkrumah used to say, we knew that political kingdom and all else will follow. And then we also got very annoyed about the social space, so the discriminations, the fact in apartheid you were the pass laws, the things that the indignity of really being being humiliated as second class citizens or being controlled or
Requiring
as
permission to
that.
move around freely in your own
Yes,
land.
yeah, all of that, and where to live and who to marry and all. So we got very indignant about that. And if you look at a lot of black communities and whether you're called something or other with impunity, if you look at a lot of black communities all around the world, that seems to be the only thing that still worries them. Not the fact that actually all of that is possible because we lost militarily. So none of them have done anything about being able to protect any of their spaces. And anybody else who wanted to repeat what had happened could do it today. And indeed, I was in Nigeria at Christmas burying my mother, and we woke up on Christmas morning, and we had a Christmas present from Donald Trump, who had bombed Sokoto. So this idea that the indignity of the social space is the only thing that should animate us, I find really problematic. Um, and not the other things, the economy, economic system, which we still don't control. And I'm not saying that people haven't fought to correct that, but I'm saying that given that those are actually the most important, we don't seem to put the same energy into correcting this.
So there's a lot in that response. First of all, I'm sorry about the loss of your mother. That can't be easy. And you've talked, fondly about her, the package, the pear soap, and bringing you all back to London. And so, I'm very sorry. And, we pray that her soul rests in peace. And in that response, you have responsibility for reparation and justice, possibly reconciliation, but you also don't absolve Africa of its own responsibility towards itself. But I want to stay with the United Kingdom first and then make our way back to the continent, because I want to understand clearly what you mean by reparation, reconciliation, reparative justice. Yes, you talk about going back to the roots of how all these indignities and social systems of inequality were created. But what does that look like in practice? When you write in your anthology that you look or you aspire or you expect a post-imperial Britain that is still active in the world, hopefully with not as much, what did you say, destruction,
Tur- Turbulence.
turbulence, I think is what you said, as
I
in the
said turbulent
past.
and deliberately.
Yeah. So what? I mean, the UK, as we speak now, is has just started with a new prime minister. We know that the far right is taking hold, across the world, including in the United Kingdom. So, what are you imagining that reconciliation looks like, that repair looks like, when rather than
I
softening and being able to hold historical misdeeds, we see a deliberate obfuscation of the past?
I want the reparatory justice from the British. The reconciliation is with Africans in the New World.
Meaning?
So that's,
Meaning
huh?
that you want Africans, people of African descent.
Well, there's been a breach, and only those of us who don't want to address the breach um, accept that there isn't a breach. And so there's a lot of work to do there. And we have to do it. And it's careful work. And there's a lot of people doing it. There's a global healing circle which I'm part of, and we have to look at how we do that. And a lot of people are angry, and some of it is also because we haven't explained what happened in the last 500 years properly. So that work is important, as to why the things that happened, why people, um, you know, accuse those on the continent of having sold them, and why those on the continent sometimes reject that. But there's a lot of work to do in that space, to effect reconciliation. So that's the reconciliation work that I'm embarked on.
Stay with stay. No,
With the Brits, it's about acknowledging what has happened. It's about then seeking ways to institute, as I say, reparatory justice, and then that is a separate conversation.
okay, so let's go back to the breach between people, diasporic Africans and continental Africans. You say, and I've heard this as well. I remember traveling in Jamaica, and when I identified myself as African, as Kenyan, I would be told, "Oh, well, you all sold us," and I didn't necessarily have a response for that. I could empathize with where that was coming from, because one of the hallmarks of colonization and imperialism was education, and sowing division. And we know that there were multiple scenarios in which people were taken, including, yes, the direct sale, but also we know that entire communities were overrun. So what does reconciliation look like 500 years later when we haven't started having those conversations? They're happening in small pockets. You talk about the healing circles and various others, but even just the capacity, of those on the continent, those of us on the continent, of those of us in the diaspora, to recognize that something happened and some people were involved, and we find ourselves trying to find each other through all of that putrid history.
Yeah, and it's not just in small circles. I mean, Ghana has been doing some major work. I mean, I've just written a piece which will be published soon about, Ghana's century-long attempt at reconciliation.
So let's name
Which
it. You're
so
you're quite right. They created, was it Joseph, where they allow people from
project,
the Joseph
the
project, where
Joseph
they
Project,
bring
yeah.
allow people from the diaspora to come back and
No, but I said
settle.
a century long, century
Yeah,
long. So
yeah.
this has been going on for a
And then we
century.
also know
Yeah,
that President Mahama has called for reparations. And we know
yeah.
that CARICOM, the Caribbean countries, are also beginning to call for reparations.
No, they called for reparations before us. So, so what's happened is that the two efforts have merged. I mean, we called. I mean, Abiola did something in '92 where the OAU officially took it on, and then the modern reparations movement was born then, with that Lagos and Abuja, with both the Lagos and Abuja conferences, and then the establishment of the eminent persons group, which was an African and diasporic eminent persons. So they had people from the diaspora on that group, and that was paid for by Abiola in Nigeria, the person who wasn't allowed to become president. And had he become president, we would have been a lot further in this process, because even before he ran for president, he put his money into that process because he believed deeply in it. And probably he and Nkrumah were the two big post-war African figures who took on this project of reparations and reconciliation. So there are some efforts, but I think to explain this, I mean you're right, and you have to have models for how you look at this. The Ghanaians tried that model of the Joseph Project, which was, in the end, if you know the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, and many of us in Africa and now in the West, those of us in the diaspora in the Atlantic world, they're Christians, so they would have a model. They would have that model at their heart. His brothers sell him into slavery, and then they then visit Egypt, where he's been reinvented as the pharaoh's interlocutor, and then they don't recognize him or whatever, and then that reconciliation takes place, and he eventually, after much testing and of them, he kind of they reconcile there in Egypt. So there is that model. I think the Ghanaians tried to do it. It didn't work. So they then have tried this. They tried then the Year of Return, which was a lot more successful because it combined lots of different elements. It wasn't exclusively a focus on the past. It was also to say, okay, we need to look at what happened in the past, but as we're looking at that, let's try and build a future together. So it was, and let's let's enjoy each other. Come enjoy Ghana, take citizenship, some of these things, and then let's try and see if we can also build a future together. So different models are being tried on scale. I mean, Ghana is doing this at a scale that is very impressive. But we have to understand what happened, and that's where programs like this are important. You know, in our healing circles, people were full of that anger about you saw this, and then what you try and say to them is, okay, imagine that today is where we were 400 years ago. You have African leaders who don't want to do that, and we can name them. You know, the Congo Queen, others, and they are destroyed. Their kingdoms are destroyed. So you have a number of choices, which is you can be destroyed and try and fight. You can willfully participate, which many of them did, or you can just keep your head down. And given that this is now the global economy, because that's what it was, we were seeing the beginnings of the formation of this global financial trading system. You just play along. So compare that to today. The Africans who don't want to be dominated by British, French, and American imperialism, what happens to them? We know what happened to Sankara. We know what happened to Lumumba. We know what happened to Gaddafi. And I said to my African American friends, does the fact that the president, when an African president is sodomized in the streets of his country, does the fact that the president in the US is an African American, does that make you complicit in what happened in Libya? Does the fact that a few years later Libya becomes a destabilized state, a failed state where slavery of black Africans returns to the markets, does that make you complicit? Or is both Obama and all these people around him, the Susan Rices, are they serving other interests that the vast majority of African Americans don't serve? So you try and get people to understand that what we're dealing with are global economies. And there we are as individuals caught up in this, in the slipstream of these big global forces. And inside of that, yes, we can make choices, but those choices are within that framework. And then, even more pointedly, I say to them, you do realize what happened in Gaza. The person at the UN in front of all the other countries who was defending that was an African American woman. The VP was an African American woman. The Minister, Secretary of State for Defense was an African American man. The head of the army was an African American man. Does that make you complicit for what happened in Gaza? And I never really get an answer. But what we do begin to then discuss is actually this bigger global context, this Atlantic world that was being constructed and which we are still living inside of, and which probably in the next 20, 15 years is, we can see it collapsing, will collapse. And then what's the new thing that comes in? And then this is the more important question. What does global Africa do inside of this new thing that is going to be constructed? Are we still just going to be obsessed with people calling us names in that social space and telling us where we can live and discriminating us? Or are we going to be serious about being enough to create, as Garvey once said, a power that will stop people doing stuff to us? But not many of us don't want that conversation. To this day, I still don't understand why.
You reference Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, all these other luminaries from the diaspora helped us think about global Africa. And so when you talk about global Africa, how does that sit alongside Pan-Africanism? Is Pan-African obsolete? Has it given way to global Africa? Um, where do we sit in terms of our leadership, our perspectives, and our philosophies of how we lead ourselves?
I think I don't want global Africa so that it can be this, you know, force that does, that is out there and almost doing this same kind of imperialism that some of the other forces are doing. I'm wanting a force that actually just protects ordinary Africans, and I'm struck by the fact that over 500 years, ordinary Africans are not protected. And how do we understand why that is? Why is it that we always feel at risk? Even in South Africa, which during this period of solidarity, during Pan-Africanism that we all got together, South Africa was the greatest expression of that solidarity. We all felt that we supported it and liberated it, and then ordinary Africans are still not safe in South Africa.
You're talking about the current outbreak of not xenophobia, but Afrophobic attacks
Yeah, well,
and
whatever we choose to call it, the the end result is that an African that is from outside South Africa, even some now who are from within South Africa who look like they might be from outside South Africa, are
are not
being
safe.
menaced in terms of their phenotype. So there is there is this issue that we kind of need to deal with: who will protect and what force will protect the ordinary African, and that's what I'm kind of trying to talk about. Of course, with Pan Africanism, you know, my take on it now is that there's been, it's better to talk about Pan Africanisms rather than just Pan African, but Pan Africanism, because there have been several types. And I mean, there have been several processes of trying to unify global Africans. So there was the, you know, the Marcus Garvey expression. There was the expression that has come through the congresses, which is its own process. There's the expression that has come through the OAU, which is that continental expression. There is the expression of the regional groupings that are trying. I mean, each of those, they run in parallel tracks. All of them want say they want the same destiny, but there are kind of different processes trying to get there. Um, the continental one for a long time didn't was just a geographic expression, and then now talks about the diaspora as their sixth region, but not in the constitution. It's more an aspiration. So that you have all these different ways. So there's kind of geographic Pan-Africanism, which is the continent. There's a kind of cultural, emotional one, and there's one most of us buy into, which is kind of the Pan-Africanism of music and sport, and where all of us, we see we enjoy each other's music and each other's sporting prowess, and for the first time we supported each other. Although I noticed at this World Cup, many Africans didn't support South Africa. So there's something that is not happening that worries me, and that we need to pay attention to, I guess. Does that make sense? I don't know.
It certainly does. But it also is very disheartening. And so, is there any hope? Because this season focuses on leadership. The season of Fearless podcast focuses on African leadership philosophies and perspectives, and what we might have to offer a world in crisis. And when I listen to you, I don't hear much.
About
I
what?
about what Africa and our leadership, our value systems might offer the world.
Well, I think we have to explain where we are. And there's no point offering solutions when people don't really, South Africa was offered as a solution. And
The
here we
Rainbow
are 30
Nation.
years later. Huh?
The Rainbow Nation.
Yeah, here we are 30 years later. We, at the time, I said, no, that is not a solution. I was raising the kind of questions I'm raising now. And everybody says, oh, you're, what is it? Pouring water on our parade, or I don't want to use the rude term, you know? And so, we go, and here we are 30 years later. Oh, okay. You can't build future realities on not understanding what you've been through and what you're going through. So that's what I want to
But
point
South
out. And
Africans would argue, and I think you have argued this yourself, because Britain certainly was one of the sites of anti apartheid activism, that the South African state has failed to look after its citizens. For those of us on the outside looking in, it's amazing that the people that local South African citizens are targeting are other Black people. And so I come back to the question of leadership, Ubuntu, Sankofa, Omoluabi, all these things that we have, the richness. And you edited a book, Under the Tree of Talking, Leadership for Change in Africa, which for me evokes the founding president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, saying, look, we sat down under a tree and we spoke until we agreed. And so, again, I ask you, with all of these fractures and the polarization around the world, what do we have as Africans to offer the world?
I'm I'm tired of Africans offering the world stuff. Let's offer ourselves something. Let's offer ourselves protection. I've said to you, you know, the leadership that protects Africans, I'm interested in. All this other stuff about, we're saints and, and all of this stuff. We tend to be liked globally when we're saints and give up our advantages and don't talk about our issues. So I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in somebody who will protect the African child. When I grew up at 10, about a million or more of us, and many of them children because they died from kwashiorkor. Nobody protected those African children. So I want to focus on that. I'm not interested in, and I don't want the South Africans attacking white people in South Africa. I want the South Africans
No one
to
wants
do,
anyone
to do,
attacked.
yeah, to deal with their with why the economy is not growing. Yeah, and part of that is that the majority of the economy is locked out of the economy. Yes, and they have to deal with that. And the deal that they did at independence is, was not a good deal. And you can't dress up a good deal with mythology about the Rainbow Nation because Africans in the 1960s or by 1975, everybody said most Africans' trouble started in African countries because by 15 years, everybody understood that you couldn't eat freedom. Yeah. So freedom is not an abstraction. In Igbo culture, a free person was a person with land, an Amadi. So you have to have the means to actualize your freedom. So if you then give me a deal where 80% of you don't have the land, I know you're not really interested in freedom. Yeah, that there's something else that is going on. If you can't defend that freedom, I know you're not interested in freedom. Yeah. So, it's like we've just had a change of government here, and he's come out and he's making all these noises, Andrew Burnham. And I'm like, okay, but the debt hasn't changed. So he has a choice. Is he going to raise more taxes or is he going to borrow more? He hasn't made a decision on that. So whatever he's saying is just for, in 6, 7 months' time, we'll be back where Keir Starmer was. And then, people will find something else to dislike him. With Keir Starmer, it was two-tier policing. They might find something else with him. But the fundamentals are not dealt with. And the fundamentals are this um, for the West. And that is the conversation I want to have with the West, which is, can we have a conversation about you and Africa? We've known each other for 400 years. Can we have a proper conversation now about how we do a new relationship that is not based on what it's been for 500 years, 500 years? And the reason we need to have that conversation is that because I read and read and read and read. In 85 or so, I was reading something, and there was a great journalist. I used to read him a lot. And he worked for the Sunday Times. And he produced this article that said, oh, for the first time, the biggest trade route in the world is now across the Pacific from America to China. For 300 years before, or 200 years before that, it had been across the Atlantic. So from 85, Europe was already in decline, relatively. Yes? And then around 2000, I read another article which said that actually by 2030, the biggest trade route in the world will be within Asia. So now you can understand why all the wars are happening in where they're happening and why Ukraine is so important to stop that Eurasia connectivity across Europe. So the question is, those are the fundamentals. And nothing I've seen so far has shifted them, even with in fact, all I've seen are retreats. So the Americans have retreated from Afghanistan. And for the first time, there's no American presence from Iran all the way to China. They retreated from Vietnam. So if eventually they retreat from Iran and retreat from the Gulf, which might be what's on the cards, then that Eurasian reality is going to take place. Now, the question is, how does everybody else in the world respond to that Eurasian reality? How are Africans thinking about responding to the Eurasian reality? How is the Europeans who have been in decline thinking of that? The South Africans think it's by, doing all this very infantile stuff against other Africans. I understand why the irritation and the anger, but it's, given the big picture, it's foolishness. And then the Europeans, you say, well, they're saying, oh, we're not, we're going to resist Euro Africa, but you have Euro Africa already. If France got to the World Cup final, it would be Euro Africa that got to the World Cup final. The English team that beat France had 7 diasporan Englishmen, African descendant in it. So the Euro Africa is already there. The conversation with Nigel and all these people is about admitting the reality of what's on the ground, and for us not to be so defensive about everything, but to actually say, I don't quite understand what all this is about. I mean, France, without the resources of Africa, is France viable? So instead of the French swanning around thinking that somehow they're in control of something they're not, can we sit down and have a proper conversation as two grown-ups? But I think part of the problem in that equation is that, some of the Africans are leaders and others don't behave as grown-ups.
Onyekachi, we're closing what has been a fascinating, rich, and thought-provoking conversation. And you sort of answered one of my closing questions to you, which was framed around if you could leave the next generation of African leaders with one idea drawn from African intellectual traditions, what might that be? And you sort of answered it without speaking about the new crop of leaders we're seeing, say, for instance, across the Sahel, the ownership of space agency. But there is one question, which I hear in your responses. And so my final question to you is, what have Africans forgotten about themselves that we most need to remember?
And body sovereignty. And that's what I mean about us being our own agents. You did say about a big thing that we could do. I mean, there are lots of caveats, but I like what Dangote is trying to do, purely because one of the things we do have to pay attention to as Africans is production.
Aliko Dangote, the industrialist.
Yeah. We have to pay attention seriously to production, because if we can't produce on scale, then all the things that we need and more, including the means to defend ourselves, then we will continue to be everybody else's junior partner. So he's one person. I'm sure there are many others across the continent, but he demonstrably is showing that actually this production on scale is really important. And I know there are lots of caveats, as I say, around the monopolistic tendencies, around who is the labor force, who are the engineers for that. I know he's brought in a lot of Indians, but the fact that he's still able to do that and mobilize capital. He's going to do this IPO where he's talking now about mobilizing capital from within Africa to begin to do this kind of that intervention at scale. That gives me the hope, as you're asking for solutions, and that's something that we have to address, that the leadership has to address. And then, this idea of if we're going to have these free trade areas, then we have to, have as I call it for a piece that I just wrote, where you have to, you can't just have, the FCTA as a market. It needs a Pan-African market. It needs Pan-African ethics. So there's this idea of markets as moral communities, and so these guys, they just can't come to London as some of them did and say, "Come and invest in us." There was a guy who runs Invest Durban, and he was doing these incredible flip charts about Durban, and he reimagined Durban as a Dubai on the Indian Ocean, and it was all wonderful. And I'm thinking, but then this was the 3rd of June, at the same time as the Zulu warriors in Durban were giving Africans an ultimatum to leave by the 30th in blood-curdling terms. Well, it was peaceful, but everybody understood the threats behind that. So, that FCTA can't be a market for investors and not for Africans, ordinary Africans, and their mobility and the defense of their body sovereignty. So yes, if my childhood taught me anything, is that we need to protect ourselves.
And that's where we'll end the conversation for now. Onyekachi, thank you so very much. You've been most generous with your time and your thoughts. Thank you. I'm Udo Akamimo, and this is Fearless.